Good evening and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council. It is Monday, November 6, 2023. It is 7 p.m. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. We will begin tonight's meeting with the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance given by Mr. Sievert. Please stand.
Please bow our heads. Our Father, we gather here today and seek your love, guidance, and protection for those that serve this community. Our first responders, our many volunteers hosting charitable events, our teachers forging the minds of the future leaders of our fine city. All of those that invest their time, talents, and energy for the betterment of Troy and its citizens. As we are here on the eve of an election, there is division in the world, our country, our state, and our community. Lord, let us seek resolution and unity towards these issues as they are decided with your guiding hand and in the manner which you dictate. And as the matters reach their inevitable conclusions and there are winners and losers, let us strive to put away our differences and remember the words you shared on the mound in Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist. Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Marshall. Here. Mr. Roselle.
Here.
Mrs. Sneed. Here. Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Sievert.
Here.
Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Present.
Motion to excuse Mr. Twist.
Second. It has been moved to excuse Mr. Twist by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Roselle.
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Twist is excused.
Motion to excuse Mr. Pierce.
Second.
It has been moved to excuse Mr. Pierce by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Roselle.
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This time we'll have a presentation from Mr. Donnie Knight from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, providing an update to the Miami River Lowhead Dam Removal Project.
Thank you. It's been a while since I've spoke on this to the group, so it may be newer to some of you than others, but so I just wanted to give a brief update, kind of where this all started and where we're at today. I'll try to make it quick, and if we have time for questions, we can do that. So, the low dam removal and restoration of the Great Miami, discussions first began in 2016. They're very basic, just looking at opportunities to do river restoration in the Great Miami River watershed. Some of the reasons for dam removals, you know, every dam is a little bit different, but some of the very basic reasons we look at this is, one, safety. You know, low head dams can be dangerous to users of the river, paddlers, fishermen, things like that. From 2018 to 2021 nationally, there were 150 deaths on low dams because of the hydraulic that's formed below them. Here in the Great Miami watershed, 2020, unfortunately 2 lives were lost and 2 were rescued on the low dam in Sydney. And there's, you know, examples here in Ohio beyond that. So safety is one. Something that we look at in our agency is water quality and aquatic life improvements. So the Ohio EPA makes stream designations to water quality for all our streams in Ohio. The highest rating or designation that they give is exceptional warm water habitat. The Middle Great Miami, we're lucky to to have exceptional warm water habitat in all but the pools related to the Troy and Piqua dams, where it drops to just warm water habitat. So there's an opportunity to increase water quality, both the physical and chemical aspects of water, but also the biological life of the water quality. Another reason, recreation, economic opportunities. 1.9%, I just looked this up today, just out of curiosity, 1.9% of the current gross domestic product, which results in $454 billion, is related to outdoor recreation. Examples locally that I think, is one of the selling points from a recreational and economic benefit is, if you drive around in the summertime, this is an example I give a lot. If you drive around in the summertime, you go to these bridges. Troy recently put in a new parking area at the State Route 41 bridge. Immediately outgrew itself with all the recreational paddlers and fishermen and campers and you name it. Same thing can be seen at Tip Elizabeth Park, or the park at Tip Elizabeth. I don't know what the name of it is. People parking in the grass, These are all paddlers, the same interest that, I'll compare it because oftentimes we look at the dam and the historic use of these pools. The same energy and use of the river is happening still today. It's just happening in a different way. And the paddle sports and angling opportunities, people are looking for those free-flowing areas. That's where they recreate. It's not to say that nobody uses the pools, but certainly that's changed since the 50s and 60s, how they use the river. So I think, with recreational opportunity, obviously comes economic opportunity. So that's just some of the real basic benefits, if you will. The kind of moving forwards from kind of just the discussion of if this is an option for the city of Troy and city of Piqua, we started to go into a feasibility study. We worked with Flatland Resources consulting firm, and we did a lot of stuff in-house through our agency for the biological assessments. And that, if you've not seen it, that document, the feasibility study report, goes into a lot greater detail on a lot of this, but that is available. So from there, we moved to how can we fund this? So as of right now, we have funding secured through the Ohio EPA's WRRSP program, which is Water Resource Restoration Sponsorship Program. And that's basically money that's available to municipalities, communities, landowners that will restore aquatic systems, wetlands, streams, that kind of thing. So it doesn't always have to be low dam removal, but that's one of the areas where we can reach ecological lift in the stream and improve water quality. So that money is secured. We're waiting. I was hoping to have word by the time this meeting came around. Feel pretty confident about it, but we're also looking at the state H2 Ohio program. The state wetland money has been available for a few years. We've completed wetland restoration projects throughout the state. Now they have a river initiative program, and we are currently looking at the potential of up to somewhere around $3.8 million, depending on what they decide there. So, and then if need be, we'll also look at one additional source of funding, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Fish Passage Program, if there's any shortfall to get the restoration completed. So the scope of work under these programs, just real basic, we're looking to improve sediment transport. A lot of sediments accumulate behind the dam, not just this dam, but all dams, there's a life expectancy where those sediments start to fill. So we'll increase sediment transport through the removal of the dam, we'll increase fish passage, restore fish habitat throughout the pool, or throughout where the existing pool is. All that area will improve for fish communities and other aquatic life. We will establish more natural conditions. Part of that is it's kind of a balance when you work in an urban setting. We're trying to do as much river restoration and improve that to the best of our abilities, given the current situation of the river and the future uses. Things like buried utilities, we have to protect. We can't allow the river to scour those out and expose those, so there'll be various in-stream habitat that will protect those areas and not allow the scour to occur, where other areas will allow that sediment transport to flush out the river and restore its natural channel alignment. And along with that, this is what I refer to a lot as a working lands type situation. So we're in a flood protection area. Miami Conservancy District has flood protection levees. Right now, the current alignment of the river is that the river flows right along the concrete revetment. Not ideal for the aquatic organisms, fish communities, so one of our goals, it has a lot of reasons, but one of them is to move the river off of that levee revetment so we can get natural structure along that side of the river. The other aspect of it that I think is probably one of the most important is we know anyone that's lived in this community for a while has seen the gates drawn down. Conservancy District has to go in. There's various activities they have to do for flood protection and ensuring that levee is stable. And they currently have to draw down, potentially put a stone path, equipment pad to get in there, and each time that happens, there's disturbance to the river. So this would offer, by creating a floodplain bench, this would offer an area where work can continue to be done down the road as needed, but the stream substrate and the aquatic life in the stream doesn't have to be disturbed. Really important for the species that we manage for, as well as what EPA and DNR and folks are interested in. So another aspect of it is the oxbow that's around Miami Shores Golf Course. I believe after the 1913 flood, that river channel was cut off. The river was straightened as we see it now below the dam to 41 Bridge. Oxbow habitat is a critical habitat for a lot of species, provides great water quality benefits from nutrient and sediment uptake, and right now the upper end of it is cut off from the Miami Shores Road. I can't think of the name of it, but
Rutherford Drive.
Rutherford Drive, thank you. Right now it's cut off, so in MCD's flood model, that's a pinch point. Troy in general is a pinch point in the flood model, but we can install culverts under that road that allows water when the river comes up. Instead of blocking that, it allows water to move through, so we can see a drop in the flood stage overall with all of these projects done in unison. Real quick on just some of the general things that have happened. Much like this meeting, we've had 8 public meetings, 5 of which were related to Troy, and then some were joint Troy-Piqua. So this would make, I guess, the 9th overall meeting that we've provided information on the project. Flatland Resources, as I mentioned, did the feasibility study. They developed the initial designs and cost estimates, and they finalized those in 2021. They're working on the management plan, which is part of the WRSP needs to get through that. We have to have an approved management plan from EPA. And that's also part of the environmental covenants that are placed to protect EPA's investment, which just real basically states that for the most part, you leave the habitat that's there, it won't be removed if it's funded through EPA, and if things have to be done in the future to modify or change something, that they can have oversight and review of that to ensure it's done in a correct way. So right now, we're currently doing monthly meetings with the Miami Conservancy District, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, City of Troy, some members of the City of Troy, and the OEPA WRSP program. Occasionally, we have additional folks come in that maybe have expertise in a certain thing, like small-bodied fish or something like that. So that's happening monthly. Those will continue to occur through the life of the project. And I mentioned the funding. And then just last thing, kind of where we're at now, we interviewed 3 consulting firms, professional consulting firms, all great candidates, had a lot of experience in this type of restoration. During the next committee meeting, there'll be a request for to meet meet the contract. I don't know what the exact title or explanation would be, but basically to move forward with that firm so we can see through the final designs. Right now, there's going to be a continual evaluation of what design options work. There's, as I mentioned, there's utilities we have to take into account, things like that. So there's a few different design options, and basically the end result will be one that protects utilities, provides the greatest gain for the City of Troy, but also gain for the river and water quality. So to be continued on that. So that's all I have in terms of updates. Happy to answer questions if...
Mr. Seward.
Mr. Knight, thank you for coming. I think I kind of convened this little foray, and or at least requested you to come. And really the primary reason was there was some differing opinions as to what the pool would be like around Treasure Island and the depth of the river and those sorts of issues. And I went back to the news article when we had our meeting in 2021, and I specifically asked you those questions, and you indicated that all existing activities should basically be able to be continued. And then I think you indicated that there's some in-stream structures that we could implement to maintain the depth and flow as desired. So I think that was a direct quote from you. So the question, I guess, is that was sort of stated differently at our meeting when we did the request for the pathway. Mm-hmm. And so I just really wanted you to come and corroborate, or if that needs to be changed, at least let council know, because I think that was very important for council that Treasure Island was going to maintain its pool and that we could still use it for recreational activities.
Yeah, so from the very beginning, that was one, we had certain criteria that we knew we were going to have to meet to basically have a seat at the table, if you will. One being that the Treasure Island Harbor remains a pool. So the design, speaking with the firms, the information that we've provided, some of the modeling that we've done, all of the design options account for maintaining a pool at Treasure Island. What we haven't decided yet is, and I'll just run through a few just real basic design concepts of how it may look. We can manipulate the pool elevation within the main stem of the river, and then that elevation is transferred to the Treasure Island pool. There's also an option of cutting off or changing the elevation of Treasure Island pool, not the elevation of the water, basically changing the ground elevation to maintain that pool, but not be so drastic in what we have to do in the river. Another option that I think, could really benefit, knowing some of the constraints of the Treasure Island pool, and it comes down to engineering and how we can make that work, but we're also looking at the opportunity to provide some flow through that pool. If anybody came down this summer, it wasn't unique to just Treasure Island, the whole river had it, but in areas like the harbor where there's no flow, the duckweed, which I was telling folks that had asked, it's actually a better situation than, filamentous algae or things like that. It's a native plant, and it provides food for ducks. It's called duckweed. But it is unsightly, right? I mean, to the passerby, it looks like a mat of algae. So there's really no difference aesthetically. But, just a little bit of flow could really help that situation. It could also help the fine sediments, sands, gravels, things like that in high energy events are going to dissipate and drop out in areas. I mean, that's just part of a river system. But the real fine, mucky type soils and materials that are deposited in there, with a little bit of flow, we can increase, some of that transport through there. So that's one of the options that are exciting to me because it addresses another problem. But that's some of the design that we're going to get into. We'll address that more specifically with engineering and hydrology. But yes, the Treasure Island pool will stay at its current level, and it will remain a pool. So, anything else?
Any other questions?
If I may.
Mr. Phillips?
There's a system of weirs or what the rock formations that you will have to guard on some of the infrastructure that is in the riverbed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you have any idea how many of those weirs there may be?
At a very minimum, we're going to have to stabilize the stream bed in just below each of the utilities. So we have fiber optics, we have drinking water mains, probably sewer mains. There's a whole host of different things. So at a minimum, we'll have stabilization structures. Now, some of those may look different. They're not necessarily going to all look exactly the same, but at a minimum, we will have at each of those a stabilization type structure. And then again, one that isn't related to a utility, basically we're going to use oftentimes in dam removal. It's rare that the entire dam clear down into the substrate is removed. Oftentimes you'll leave the footer because that acts as a natural stabilization. Because what typically, in Troy's situation, it was an area that was dredged. It's had a lot of modification over the years. For the past 100 years, there's been modifications. There's been dredging. There's been dams in different locations. So, part of this restoration is we have to stabilize the substrate in some areas, but we also want to excavate substrates in some areas to realign the river channel during restoration, and then we want to allow scour and sediment transport to occur in other areas. So, one of the things that I've talked about in the past is, and we've seen it with the gates drawn down, by no means will it look like that in restoration. I didn't think it looked good either, like most people that saw it. The biggest change really is the width of the river. The depth of the river, believe it or not, I know it was kind of hard for me to believe, but when the gates were pulled, I went out and we did surveys, cross-sectional surveys, and the term we use is bow wag, and that's like the deepest part of the river channel, anywhere in the river. If you cross it, when you get to the deepest part, that's the bow wag. Even with all that sediment accumulation, right after the gates were pulled, the river didn't have any time to do anything. We were still, thigh-deep water, even though it looked like it was barely draining. And, that sediment transport process would continue. So you'll get a lot of depth. It'll be varying depth. It's not going to be a homogeneous pool like it is now, currently. But that's also going to improve water quality. It's going to improve fishing. It'll still be paddleable, made up word there. You can kayak, canoe, stand-up paddleboards. All that stuff occurs throughout the Great Miami River system, and quite honestly, as I mentioned before, I feel that the community, Troy and Piqua, are missing out on a big portion of river users because of the pool. So people seek out, I am one of those people seek out those free-flowing stretches where there are riffles and there are pools and there's structure and diversity. And everybody, likes the sound of moving water. So that's going to be the biggest change, width of the river. It won't dry up. I know that's a common concern, but the same volume of water that's flowing down the river will be coming through. It'll just be in a little bit different alignment.
So with the free flow, do you have a scientific wild guess on how much narrower it will be initially, and then it will grow over time?
So, basically, this thing, picture's worth 1,000 words. I would suggest if you wanted to see it, go into areas where it's free-flowing. So, below the Troy Dam to Tip City, that's all free-flowing. Now, river systems in their natural state look different. Every corner it looks a little different. But generally speaking, the width of the river is going to be what you see in non-impounded areas. Right now, the river's approximately 3 times wider than it naturally would be.
So in the movement on the south side against the concrete levee wall, the bench, is that what you're calling it?
Floodplain bench.
Floodplain.
Correct.
Will grow north.
It'll be basically linear feet. It's going to go from the current dam location up to Treasure Island. Now, Treasure Island, when you get past the concrete revetment, it widens out real quick.
Right.
We wouldn't extend that bench up along Treasure Island. It would just be tied into Treasure Island.
To that existing piece.
To that existing piece, where there's like a little island up there, right in that area.
So would the bench on the north side of the river would be channeled, the channel would be northward a bit to move and allow some...
Yeah, so if you were standing at Treasure Island looking down towards Adams Street Bridge, the river would move to the river left, north side, yeah. So it would move over that distance, I won't, don't hold me to an exact feet, but probably looking at, somewhere around 30 feet. It would have to be accessible with heavy equipment, or, we're wasting our time for that benefit if MCD can't get equipment.
I just wanted to make sure that kind of the picture that I was
Yeah.
envisioning off of what you were saying was kind of correct.
And elevation-wise, probably you're looking at, there's a current bike path on the north side by the stadium. Elevation-wise, we're probably looking at about that same height. So it absolutely will go underwater, as probably a high percentage of the bike path from up here clear to Cincinnati. That's a common occurrence. It is a maintenance issue, but it's one that already exists and is dealt with, so.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Schilling?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. In other words, it's been estimated several times that for the city of Troy to maintain that pond at Treasure Island, to dredge it correctly, we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars every 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is that, in my understanding, is when we take the dam out, the river is going to actually drop, what, 6 to 8 feet?
Yeah, the what we call the wedge at that point is about somewhere between 6 and 7 feet.
6 and 7 feet. So there's always concern of flooding in that area around the White House at Treasure Island. But if the river drops 6 to 8 feet or so, and it's 3 feet above flood stage now, so really then the river would have to rise almost 10 feet before we would have flooding in there, without essentially backing the water up to fill the pond in. Would that be a fair estimate?
Well, so the stream elevation change from Treasure Island Pool to what we would have to make up, that's in an area where some of that water is going to be there year-round. In terms of flood stage, as we, in CD and FEMA modeling, we're probably looking at something like a 1 foot drop in flood stage. Now, the frequency, I think, is probably something, we're in a leveed system, so at I'm just going to say, just from wetland projects in the area connected to the river, currently I think our stream gauge is 1.9 to 2.2 feet. Treasure Island, this is just giving examples. Treasure Island's probably receiving water, and if anybody pays attention to stream gauges, I'm probably the only one in the room that does, but if you look at those stream gauges, you're going to see a decrease. Flood stage is flood stage. I mean, even minimum or moderate flood stage. Flood stage in this part of the river is 14 feet on the gauge. Right now, I said it's, say it's 2.2 roughly. So that's never going to change. I mean, Treasure Island will be under feet of water at flood stage. What you will see is the frequency decrease of when Treasure Island has water flooding it. So a little bit of a flood stage drop, but I wouldn't say so much that you're going to resolve. I don't want to give the impression that we're resolving all flooding, particular in an area where it's leveed. So did I steer around that or help?
The reason I ask that is that, as I look at it, I think that, and the question is would it be possible to fill in that pond at Treasure Island and eliminate that stream coming in, and then use that area? Would that area be usable as additional either recreation or an outside restaurant type of a thing, where essentially the restaurant equipment is movable? They do that in Hilton Head. Mm-hmm. They have these restaurants that sit, right right near the ocean, and of course when storms and things come in, they just pack everything up and move it to high ground, and when it comes back, they plug everything back in. Mm-hmm. And so, in my own mind, that would be, I think, be a great addition as an outdoor restaurant area. If we filled all that in and made a hard surface, you'd have tables out there with umbrellas and then somebody playing a guitar, and just to have maybe a lower cost, more casual restaurant dining experience there, and then move all the boating things to the river's edge, to ramps and things, so we still have access to the river at that particular point, but we would have a better use and maybe attract actually more people to the rivers by having a recreational area or restaurant area at Treasure Island. Mm-hmm. An additional restaurant area at Treasure Island. And so I know when I talked to you the last time, the idea was one of the ideas that you had expressed is that we would, I think you call them weirs, where you store the rocks in the river, mm-hmm. and essentially we are building a dam-like structure to back that water up so it would fill the Treasure Island area, or keep it filled as it is now. Yeah. And of course that costs a lot of money to do that, and I guess the question, if we filled it all in, would it be any cost savings by doing that and moving things to the edge of the river versus trying to build another dam and take out one dam, build another dam just to keep that pond
Right.
from becoming a problem for the city of Troy to have to dredge every 10 years or so.
Right. So, we're taking a, quite honestly, the design, as I kind of mentioned, we're looking at options, because there are things that, you know, an engineer will figure it out at a cost, right? So we're trying to meet the city's demands, or interests, you know, to have a seat at the table with this, right? We want water quality, we want better fish populations, fish communities, more recreational opportunity. You know, going into it, and still to this day, it's always been maintain water. Not necessarily for me to decide what's better, I think that's a community thing. I will say that I don't see what your vision of what's possible with that area and the repurposing of that area. I don't see a reason why you couldn't explore that at a later date outside of this project happening. So,
Well, we're using your money
basically-
now instead of ours, I guess.
What's that?
I said, we're using your money now instead of ours.
Right.
You know, so I mean, you gotta build a dam, so you got an expense to build that dam, you could take that money and use that to fill in Treasure Island.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen another, would be my
Right.
guess.
It's really not that simple, Mr. Schilling. It would probably add $1 million to $2 million to the project, because simply filling in the harbor is not going to impact the kind of things that the weir system and the rock formations are in the main river.
Well, the weir system, we're gonna spend, and again, the cost estimate was several $100,000 building that weir to back the water up, so it fills the pond. From I think our last discussion, it was in that neighborhood, several $100,000.
Well, that's a side benefit. That's also something that,
But there's no utilities out there that we're trying to protect, in other words, by Treasure Island.
No,
All we're doing is taking one dam and moving it 800 yards north to essentially fill in Treasure Island.
Yeah, and that's, yes and no. I mean, I wouldn't say, the difference between what we're doing in stream is comparing it to a low dam, is we're talking a magnitude. We're not making up any pool elevation at Treasure Island with one structure, and then in that case, EPA wouldn't have been interested, our agency, because we wouldn't be able to meet the water quality and aquatic life attainment by doing that. What we can do is we can provide in-stream habitat. So these structures can be used for a multitude of different things. It can be to maintain a pool elevation, a critical pool elevation. They can be used to direct flow off of, let's say, a bridge pier is a common way they're used. They can be used to stabilize the sediment, and also to, if positioned in a certain way at a certain elevation, they can actually be used to create scour and maintain an open pool or hole, if you will. So I think, right now, this is a way for us to basically get the ecological benefits to the river while also meeting some of the needs of Troy. And, again, I think probably, in my guess, just looking long-term, there would be probably something that could be done, kind of a mix or a hybrid of full filling in of the pool, or the harbor, and constant dredging. I think if you work with the system, with the river, with the flow characteristics of the river, if you work with that, it'll work less against you, being the dredging, the constant dredging. So trying to add some flow through there, and you could in turn possibly gain some green space and kind of have a mix of, instead of a pool, you could have a meandering stream corridor. And these are just ideas.
Sure.
The design will ultimately tell us what's going to be financially responsible and also meet the needs of the funding source, and I think kind of Patrick alluded to it, is the funding source we're using is water quality and biological improvement based. So we can do a lot of things within that realm to work with and, you know, try to meet a compromise with a community, not just Troy, but any community we work with. It's just trying to find that middle ground where we still get what we want, but it's palatable to our landowners and partners.
And it's my understanding, and the OTA administration can help me on this, but there's no swimming and there's no fishing allowed at Treasure Island right now in the pond area. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, in the
So
harbor. In the harbor.
In the harbor, you can't swim and you can't fish.
Right, because that's the boat launch area, and it's got the fountains, and there's just too much activity going on, yes.
Okay.
But that does not cover the river.
Not the river, but
Treasure Island, yeah,
so essentially that
the harbor.
the pond up there has limited usage right now. Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
Yep.
Are there any other questions?
I do have a question,
Mr. Pierce?
and I haven't fully researched this, but Piqua has an issue coming up with their water retention, from my understanding. They have some infrastructure they're going to need to invest into. They're being required to make the investments because they have, you know, a lot of water, and I forget where the location is. But they're looking at either looking at enlarging their capacity to hold the water up in their region, or to flush it down the river for us. Would these changes that you're talking about negatively affect us if they go one way or another?
No, from a water capacity or available water to the city? Is that where you're drinking water?
Flooding.
Flooding.
When it comes to flooding.
No, so the one thing that we call these run-of-river dams, right? So they are bank to bank, and they're not like the MCD dry dam, or you see Army Corps dams that have a certain amount of volume. They purposely draw those down before flood season. The MCD dry dams are a sized culvert and a big earthen levee, so they have all this available storage. The dams in most of these low-head dam situations on the Great Miami, they're run-of-river. So I don't know if it works for people, but I'm going to go back to an example I give. It's kind of like if you fill a kitchen sink right to the top before it runs over, or it's just running over. Well, any more water that goes in it, that pool or river that space is taken up, and all the additional water goes over the dam. So there's no flood. In fact, there's a small decrease in flood stage by just removing the dam. So there's not a huge net gain. This is a big river system, huge watershed, and one small dam. But there is a decrease. Same thing with Piqua. They're gaining some flood storage space in that because the river's at a lower level. If they kept it, you don't see any benefit from them keeping it. And I think maybe we're probably combining two different projects or issues. Piqua is dealing with so Piqua is a little different. Sidney and Piqua are a little different than basically Troy South in their drinking water systems. They're partially on bedrock, so they have to find other means to have water to meet the needs of the community. So they use those, I think there's 3 lakes, Swift Run, I don't know all the names, but so there is a study going on of they have to update those for dam safety to basically have those and provide that water, but do it in a way that it doesn't. They're a much higher class dam than what we're dealing with because of the amount of water that they're storing above natural level. If those were to fail, it could be catastrophic flooding. not unlike the dams that failed in Michigan. You know, residents below holding a lot of water. These dams, really, if they failed, there would be some impact downstream. A lot of it would just be that rush of water. It wouldn't be the volume of water, it would be the rush of water. It would chew away banks, maybe blow out culverts, things like that. But, yeah, either way this goes, you're not gonna see a negative impact. If anything, it's slight, but there is a slight reduction in flood stage, so. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I have a question. The plan that was put forward referenced both projects in Piqua and in Troy, correct?
Correct.
Was the funding that has been secured for both Troy projects and Piqua projects?
Correct. So, and we knew that's where these other funding sources are coming from to meet the shortfall. We maxed out the available funds for one nomination, as they call it in that program. We maxed out to the $4 million. So we knew early on that was not going to meet the needs of this overall project. The reason we combined is because in a lot of these grants, and it's no different than the additional grants that we may look into, they're looking for landscape level changes because that's the greatest benefit to the river system itself. We look at fish passage miles, water quality, things like that. So combining and making these projects larger in scale give us a lot better chance to compete at the national level for funding. So that pot of money and future pots of money, basically what we're doing is we're writing additional grants and speaking to these other agencies to ensure that all aspects of all of these projects get completed. So.
Can you speak to how far Piqua is in terms of their process?
So, really they're about the same. There's not a huge difference from a calendar standpoint. They have under contract a consulting firm. So they're beginning to work through some of as these things go, there's some real basic information that has to be collected. Parcel data, survey data, pre-existing conditions with your macroinvertebrate, your bug life, your fish life, because we have to be able to show that there's that improvement. So a lot of it's, at most, that's probably what's happening. Where Troy is the group has to make a decision on that consulting firm and get a firm under contract, so those really important pieces of design we can figure out a design process, and when we get to like the magic number in regulatory permitting is about 30%, so at 30% design is when we can really start moving further forward with it. So the only difference is they've got their consulting firm selected. So.
And so the consulting firm will also be responsible for the project?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so they'll see through all the design, some of the permitting, some of that we do. Some of the permitting is our own agency for endangered species, but there's Army Corps, EPA, ODNR, dam safety. There's a whole host of different permits that are kind of cookie cutter for any project in the country. So they'll help with some of that. A lot of it's the data they'll be collecting as professional engineers and hydrologists, and then we'll see through that process.
Okay.
Just real quick, I just want to follow up. So is that design process then where the tow and the bike path or rec trail, whatever we're going to call it, that's where all that will be discussed?
So all aspects of the project from the earliest stages are still on the table. I can't think of anything that we've completely thrown out. We have to dial those in as to what will work, and not only work for the river, but work for the NCD. This is a known pinch point in the whole flood modeling for NCD. It's an area that they're very concerned with. So it has to be vetted probably as much as anybody through MCD. And really the design is gonna help lead us in what option's gonna work best for all the parties. But yeah, all that stuff is gonna be looked at. It's gonna be ran through various 3D hydraulic models and different things, so.
Any other questions? I know there's some residents of the river. Do you have any questions for Mr. Knight that maybe you want to ask at this time? Yes, if you could come to the podium, give your name and address, and please keep your questions short, but we'll give you an opportunity since Mr. Knight's here.
I'm Howard Wingert. I live at 515 West Water Street, which is the second house off of Adams Street. Backyard's right on the river. I guess my question was, the levee was built to protect the city of Troy after the 1913 flood. Levees were pretty much finished by about 1918, weren't they?
18 to 22, somewhere.
Okay, and the dam was put in 23, strictly for the power plant at that point, and then it became recreational use.
Okay.
So why, I keep hearing about the flooding not being less.
Yes.
Why did they build the levees so high on both sides when there wasn't a dam? And they were projecting that needed to be that high.
Yeah.
We've lived at our house for 40 years. And I've seen multiple flooding where, even with the new bridge at Adams Street, the water's barely going under the arches. Where's that water going to go if all of a sudden we're now saying this flooding's going to be less? I don't understand the concept.
Yeah, so, really everything we're doing with the dam removal, again, it's not, by no means are we going to or decrease the capacity, however you want to look at that. The MCD and really post-Katrina, all this is something that's being vetted throughout the country. There's examples of levees that were undersized, culverts that are undersized. It's the responsibility of the MCD. It may, in our lifetimes, hopefully never reach, there's never been water that actually has gone through the Taylorsville emergency spillway, but it's designed for that reason. If water were to go through the spillway, that puts the retention pool of that dam, that puts it clear up to where the Troy Dam is now. MCD, the only number, I can't tell you exact numbers on flow, but I can tell you on Piqua, their design flood protection is 78,000 cubic feet of water per second. Flood stage is probably, in our biggest floods right now, is probably a third, maybe half of that. But, we've seen just in the last 10 years, we've seen unprecedented flooding, right? We're getting, and MCD has water data to show that the 10-year average of rainfall in this area the record's been broken every year for probably the last 5 or 6 years. We've broken the 10-year average. So in some parts of the country, we're getting dry. It's a concern. We're the opposite. We're getting wetter, and we're getting more event-driven storms. So really, it's just them, hopefully it never is tested, right? And we're peaking at the top of the levee. But they will have to make certain, that's their task, is to provide that flood protection to these communities. So I won't go into, there's a whole level of hydrology that they look at that we don't look into that detail, but they will be.
Can I follow up a question?
Yeah.
Please.
Again, getting back to the flooding. If I understand correctly, you're going to possibly move the river bed a little bit to the north.
Yep.
So are we creating a fairly significant floodplain on the south side?
Significant in the sense...
the side of the river?
So the floodplain bench is more about reducing long-term impacts to the stream and the aquatic life in the stream by continually, every time we have to go in and do work, I say we, it could be City of Troy, it could be MCD. Every time that they go in, they would have to build out a stone path. I think the last time I saw that was the Adams Street Village. They had a long stone equipment path, basically, that was built out.
Again, my
Well,
question gets down to the width of the river
Yeah.
being shifted north, the width of the river being reduced by 50% or more.
Yep.
So what's going to be on the south side? You shifted it this way, so is it going to be a big floodplain, or is this going to be a slope?
So basically, when, on your side of the river, you'll have the levee as it is. You've got a stone or concrete revetment, right?
It's
That's the bottom, concrete revetment, then it goes into the river bottom.
Correct.
It's not ideal from a aquatic restoration standpoint to have the stream edge as concrete, you know, not natural in any way. Even the busted up concrete we see a lot isn't ideal. Provides a little more habitat, but a smooth poured concrete wall is really not ideal for anything in the river from an aquatic standpoint or a biology standpoint. The other aspect of it, and I know you mentioned it's the only time you've seen it, I've seen work being done, just work in general. Even if they didn't build out a heavy equipment pad, putting equipment in the river and disturbing the substrate is a detriment to the stream. It can be sometimes more significant than others, but if we can ensure by moving the river off of that concrete revetment, using natural stone, even some quarry stone that's structurally more sound than just using like glacial boulders, we're going to improve the overall physical characteristics of the habitat by getting it off of that revetment. But then also long term, we're going to ensure that the disturbance doesn't have to happen, because MCD is going to have to work on the levee, right? I mean, probably in my lifetime, I can think of 5 times I've seen some type of major work. Sometimes it's a stormwater outfall, sometimes it's their floodgates, it's various things, but we're trying to, if we're going to put the money and investment into making the river better, water quality, better for the critters, if you will, we want that to be a long-term, sustained, stable system, so.
Without wearing out my welcome, but again, I think you're missing my point.
Okay.
You've got the concrete revetment there.
Yep.
And in my 40 years of being here, the only work I've seen them do other than build the Adams Street Bridge is to replace all that concrete that was eroded.
Correct.
I forget how many years ago.
Yep.
And they didn't take the concrete outside of use, it's coming up short. But you're talking about the habitat of the fish being scraped along that concrete. But again, I'm a visual person.
Yes.
You're taking the river, you're narrowing it by, say, 50%.
Yep.
And you're moving it north.
Yep.
Okay, so now, on my side, the river's right there, you're dropping the level, you're moving it that way, so what's going to be there? Is there going to be somewhat like a mini floodplain?
Yeah, so it's going to be
All that?
yeah, so it's going to be roughly, and there's a lot of design before any of this is firm, but right now, the conceptual level design is you would have concrete revetment, you would have approximately the same elevation as the bike path on the other side of the river, a floodplain bench built out on that side of the river, approximately 30 feet wide. To be determined on how that's built. Some of it's going to have to be a lot heavier engineered to hold. Particular, if you look at the scour and the velocities model for MCD, that area between the first bridge pier and the levee is a really high energy point. So that might look different than down towards Market Street Bridge. But yeah, basically you're going to have your levee, your concrete revetment, and then approximately 30-foot wide bench, and then the road.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Knight. We appreciate your time this evening. Moving on, Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes of the last meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of Council, October 16, 2023. Committee reports. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared to participate in the ODOT urban paving program for an area of State Route 55 from Grant to Horizon Court. Committee recommended legislation be prepared accepting dedication of right-of-way along Dye Mill Road. Personnel Committee recommended, and it was approved, for the appointment of Phyllis Moore to the City Beautification Committee and the reappointment of Jordan Romberger and Howard Wingert to the Enterprise Zone Tax and Incentive Review Council. Resolution number R51, 2023, an agreement with Public Defender Commission for 2024, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R52, 2023, preliminary legislation with ODOT regarding the urban paving program on West Market Street, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 047, 2023, accept ConAgra plat dedication of right-of-way on Dye Mill Road, first reading and adopted. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:21 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to dispose of the minutes? It's been moved to approve the minutes by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
We have a number of committee reports this evening. We'll begin with the Finance Committee and Mr. Sievert with 2 reports.
Thank you, Mr. President. The first report is with the agreement with ESRI for GIS software services. Committee members Phillips and Rozell met October 30th, 2023 to discuss an amendment to the agreement for software for the GIS system with ESRI. The city has been using the sole source vendor based on the annual amount and the company requiring a 3-year commitment. Legislative consideration is required. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an amendment to the sole source agreement with ESRI for GIS software services for a 3-year period at a cost not to exceed $30,254 per year. The committee supports emergency legislation as the company has requested the agreement be executed prior to the end of November. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Rozell, and myself as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Mr. Schilling?
Yeah, the notes I have is, the number is $30,354, and you had $328 or something?
320.
I had $30,254 in the
Should be 350.
report.
354.
354 in here, on the agenda.
Oh, on the agenda, did you
Oh.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It should be 254, not
254.
354 on the
Okay.
agenda.
Okay.
Yeah, the committee report says $30,254.
And that does the report, so. Okay.
So when if we decide to vote on that tonight, we have to, we're voting for 254 or 354?
254.
254.
254.
30,354.
So which one's right?
$100.
All right. Okay. Can you just correct that to 254
Yeah.
as a scrivener's? Okay, it'll be 254. Thank you.
Okay,
254.
254.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling.
So we're correcting a scrivener's error, and we're voting on legislation for $30,254,
254.
Which is what you read.
which is what I read.
Yes.
Any other comments or questions on this report? Mr. Sievert, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. The second report from the Finance Committee is the adjustments to stormwater rates. Committee members Rozell and Phillips met October 30th to consider recommended adjustments to the stormwater rates. The proposed adjustments would fund operating and major capital projects for years 2024 through 2028 and not create a negative stormwater fund balance. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared providing for an annual per-month adjustment to the stormwater utility fund rate of 35 cents with each increase effective February 1 of years 2024 through 2028, as shown as the chart listed in the detailed report. I will just read the chart. So year 2024, the monthly charge of $6 will be increased by 35 cents. And that will continue, for example, 2025 would be $6.35, an increase of 35 cents, and that will continue and be compounded through year 2028, where the monthly charge will be $7.40.
Thank you, Mr. Sievert.
Respectfully submitted, Mr. Rozell and Mr. Phillips. I wasn't there at the meeting, I wasn't there tonight, so I appreciate you guys for doing it.
Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll go to the Law and Ordinance Committee, and Mrs. Snee with 2 reports.
Thank you, Mr. President. Committee members Snee and Phillips met October 30th to review information related to the Director of Law appointing assistant law directors to prosecute all cases brought before the municipal court for criminal offenses occurring within the city of Troy and the unincorporated areas of the county as required by ORC Section 190134. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a 4-year agreement with the firm of Shipman, Dixon, and Livingston, LPA, for services related to municipal court prosecution at a cost not to exceed $195,000 per year. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please continue.
Thank you. Committee members Snee and Phillips met October 30th to consider appointments to the Assessment Equalization Board, AEB, and set the meeting date and time of such board. This board would hear any appeals filed related to the estimated assessments for the completion of the Oakmont Creek Subdivision Phase 5. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared that the Assessment Equalization Board meet on November 28th, 2023 at 5:30 p.m., and that the board members be Rena Gummerlock, Roberta Jacobs, and John Terwilliger. Based on the date the AEB will be meeting, the committee supports emergency legislation. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll go to the Safety and Health Committee, and I'm hoping that Mr. Whidden could fill in for Mr. Twist this evening.
Thank you, Mr. President.
You're welcome.
This committee met on October 30th to discuss a revised agreement for the Troy Fire Department providing EMS services to Lost Creek Township. The current agreement is based on the service provided to an area of the township. Funding has been worked out based on serving the entire township through 2027. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an amended agreement with Lost Creek Township Board of Trustees for the Troy Fire Department to provide emergency medical services for the entirety of Lost Creek Township for the period 2024 through 2027, based on the township paying the amounts outlined in the detailed report. This is respectfully submitted by Mrs. Marshall, myself, and Mr. Twist as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Whidden. Are there any comments or questions on this report?
I have a couple questions.
Mrs. Marshall?
Sorry. I'm curious, is the fire department, are they fully staffed right now?
I believe we are recruiting for 2 vacancies right now.
So that's all that's vacant, I mean, or
I
just
believe
2 positions?
There's three positions they're interviewing for.
Okay, so you don't see a concern with, you know, if something were to happen, you know, on the far end of that, the new jurisdiction, if something were to happen then somewhere within Troy, that we're staffed fully enough to accommodate all of that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Whidden, please continue.
This committee also met on October 30th to discuss the 2024 funding of the Miami County Health District. Troy's funding is based on the millage equivalent that will be paid by other political subdivisions in the county for public health services. Troy's payment is funded through the general fund. The 2024 funding would be $403,524.89, an increase of approximately 8.8% from 2023 funding. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to approve the 2024 funding of the Miami County Health District for public health services for Troy citizens in the amount of $403,542.89, which is respectively submitted by Mrs. Marshall, myself, and Mr. Twist as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Whitten. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we have one final report from the Committee of the Whole, which I will give. All members of council and the President of Council participated in an October 23rd, 2023 workshop session with representatives of American Structure Point, the consultant that will be assisting with the update of the Comprehensive Plan and Zoning Code. Also attending were the Mayor, the Director of Public Service and Safety, members of city staff, consultant representatives, and citizens. The consultant stated that the update to the comprehensive plan will take about 12 months and will include an online community survey and a number of meetings with other groups they're calling stakeholder groups. Council members participated in an exercise to indicate their answers to questions about Troy. This exercise will be conducted with stakeholder groups as well, with that information compiled by the consultant to assist in the update of the plan. Additional information will be provided in the future. It was stated that the update to the zoning code will be done concurrently with the update to the comprehensive plan, but will be completed at a later time. No recommendation was to be provided as a result of this workshop. Respectfully submitted, Mrs. Marshall, Mr. Rozell, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Pierce, Mr. Schilling, Mr. Sievert, Mrs. Snee, Mr. Twist, and Mr. Whitten. Any comments or questions on that report? Seeing none, we'll move in to citizen comments for items on the agenda. We have 6 resolutions and 1 ordinance for discussion this evening. If you wish to address council on any of those items, you're more than welcome to come to the podium, give your name and address, and you have 2 minutes to address council. Seeing none, we'll move on into resolutions. We'll ask Mrs. Knight to read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R53, 2023.
Resolution number R53, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with ESRI, a sole source vendor for GIS software services, and declaring an emergency. This is a 3-year agreement, not to exceed $30,254 per year. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3rd reading rule by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening? Resolution R54, 2023.
Resolution number R54, 2023, a resolution establishing the base rate for the stormwater management utility service charges authorized by the codified ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio. This was reported on this evening. This is the first reading.
Motion to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Whitten. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
No.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
We can move forward.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It is the 3 reading rule.
7, right?
We have,
Yes.
we've,
Mm-hmm.
it's 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. I believe it was Mr. Phillips who moved to adopt the resolution, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
No.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Seaver.
Yes.
Mr. Whitten.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R-55, 2023?
Resolution number R-55, 2023, resolution authorizing the provision of legal services for the city of Troy, Ohio. This is for, associated with services for prosecution of county, of charges within the county, be paying $195,000 per year, and $138,000 of that is offset by Lima County. First reading.
Motion to suspend.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Motion to approve.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R-56, 2023?
Resolution number R-56, 2023, resolution appointing Assessment Equalization Board and declaring an emergency. This would appoint a board consisting of Renee Gummerlock, Roberta Jacobs, and John Twilliger, and they would meet November 22nd at 5:30 p.m., and this is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to approve with the clarification that the date is November 28th, 2023, on the meeting for that board.
I'm sorry, I said it incorrectly.
Yes, it is written as the 28th.
Motion to adopt.
Second.
I believe Mrs. Snee made the motion.
I made it as a motion.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear
That's
that. I did.
Yeah.
I'll
all right.
Second. The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R-57, 2023?
Resolution number R-57, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an amended agreement with the Lost Creek Township Board of Trustees. This agreement would be amended to include the entirety of the township beginning January 24th, running through December 31, 2027. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
No.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
And move to adopt, I'm so sorry.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Seaver?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
No.
Mr. Rozell?
No.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last resolution of the evening, Resolution R-58, 2023?
Resolution number R-58, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with the Miami County General Health District for health services. This would be for the year 2024. City would be paying $403,542.89. First reading.
Move to suspend?
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move to adopt?
Second.
Three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
No.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the only ordinance of the evening, ordinance 048, 2023.
Ordinance number 048, 2023, an ordinance changing the zoning of 58.093 acres of part in lot 11550 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the Miami County zoning of A2, general agriculture, to a planned development residential, PDR, and approving the general plan of the Somerset Reserve Subdivision Plan Development Residential. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. There will be a public hearing at the next meeting, first reading.
And in consideration of the public hearing at the next meeting, this will stand as the first reading of the ordinance. We'll move on to communications and announcements. Mrs. Knight, do we have any this evening?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to comments of officials. Mayor Oda.
I have nothing, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things. First of all, to clarify something that Mr. Knight said about the design engineering. We are probably looking at the earliest is coming to the council for the end of November. We're still vetting out the way the process works with engineering. We interview, we talk to them, we make basically a conditional offer, if you will, and then we talk about hours, costs, and scope of work. So we're in the process of doing that, as well as we are still securing some of the grant funding, and so hopefully by the end of November, we will have that recommendation for you. And as we talked a little bit tonight, that is the primary role of that firm is to do the detailed design as well as some construction management ultimately of the project. And it will include such things as how many weirs and where are they going to go, and some of the other structure placement and sizes as well. So I just want to clarify that. And then the other thing is we're getting into holiday season on the 23rd and the 24th, the Thanksgiving weekend, if you will. City Hall, the city facilities are closed, but recycling and refuse will remain on schedule. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Titterington. Director of Law, Mr. Kerr.
I think I'll defer my time to Mr. Frady. Thank you.
Mr. Friggy, do you have any comments tonight?
No, sir, I do not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Friggy. The only thing I will say is tomorrow is an election day, and if you've not exercised your right to vote, tomorrow's the day to do it, so please go out and vote tomorrow. Do any council members have any comments? Mr. Schilling.
Are we still on for the budget meeting on the 15th of November? It'll be held,
It's going to be held in the basement.
so if we have 20 people, if we have 20 people from the community show up, where are they going to sit?
We will either have accommodations for them down the basement, or if we have to move, then we'll move upstairs.
Okay.
We'll accommodate them.
Okay. 5 o'clock?
5:15.
5:15? On the 15th, is it 5 o'clock?
What time is it?
5:15.
5:15 p.m. 5:15.
5:15, okay. Thank you so much.
17:15.
There we go.
Makes it easy.
Do any other council members have any comments or questions this evening? Do any staff members have any comments this evening? It is now time for audience comments. you wish to address council on any item, now is your time. Please come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Hi, I'm Paula Hemrick. I keep thinking about September 15th. That was the day an active shooter alarm was set off accidentally by a substitute teacher at the Troy High School. I was relieved that there was no active shooter, and I was glad the students and staff responded as planned. But the events of that day were and probably continue to be traumatizing. I don't blame the substitute teacher for what happened. I blame our society, a society where we have planned for active shooters and tell students to either hide or run for their lives. I am heartsick and angry about the legacy of gun violence we are leaving our youth. Guns are now the leading cause of death among children and teens. Whether we are talking about mass shootings, other crimes committed with guns, suicide, or accidental shootings, gun violence is a big problem in our country, and we need to solve it. Gun violence has many causes, so we have to approach it from many different angles. We also have to get rid of a lot of obstacles to change. One obstacle is to end the gun violence is the gun industry itself. The gun industry and its special interest groups spend millions of dollars electing candidates and lobbying representatives who support policies that put corporation profits over the lives and the well-being of children. I want our legislatures in Columbus and Washington, D.C. to listen less to the gun industry and listen more to the majority of citizens who demand they do something. We need to get big money out of politics and ditch the idea that a corporation has constitutional rights, same as a natural person like you and I. This is why I support the proposal, We the People Amendment. It was reintroduced this past spring in the House of Representatives. It now has 71 co-sponsors. When passed by the Congress and ratified by the states, the We the People Amendment will regulate the money spent on political campaigns and put corporations in their proper place under the control of what we, the people, and not the other way around. We owe it to our children to end gun violence. We owe it to our children to leave them a democracy where representatives are generally accountable to the people, not to the powerful corporations and the ultra-rich. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Dee Dee Wissman. I live at 2503 Renwick Way here in Troy. I'm a volunteer with Move to Amend Miami County. I'm speaking tonight not to request anything from council, but to address a common concern people have about a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution. One concern people have about the We the People Amendment, the amendment that Paula mentioned that concerns us, is called House Joint Resolution 54, and a reminder that it was reintroduced into the House of Representatives and now has 71 sponsors. One concern people have about the We the People Amendment is that it will hurt non-profit corporations. As a consequence, folks tend to think non-profits should be exempt from the proposed amendment, particularly given the good that many non-profits often do. I'm going to explain why non-profits should not be exempted from the We the People Amendment. The explanation begins by distinguishing constitutional rights from statutory rights. Constitutional rights are inherent inalienable rights written to protect natural persons. These rights are not subject or should not be subject to the political process. That is, the government can't or shouldn't make a law that denies a natural person's inherent inalienable rights. Unlike a natural person, a corporate entity, whether for profit, nonprofit, association, or union, is created by a political process. As entities created on paper through state charters, corporations do not have inherent inalienable rights, and they are subject to the political process. Because corporations play important roles in our society, we the people, through our elected representatives, write laws to give them privileges and protections from government overreach. Corporate entities warrant statutory rights, not constitutional rights. It is also important to distinguish a corporate entity from the natural persons operating within it or benefiting from it. Excuse me, I lost my place. The We the People Amendment does not impinge on the constitutional rights of a nonprofit's members or the person it serves or represents. Natural persons retain the freedom to associate, to assemble, and to work toward a common cause. What will change with the ratification of the We the People Amendment is that we the people, through our elected representatives, will be able to make laws that regulate the money corporate entities can spend on political campaigns. These laws will likely level the playing field, giving equal voice to the small local nonprofits competing with large corporations for the attention of voters and legislators. I'm going to hand the continuing discussion over to Deb Hogshead for additional reasons why nonprofits should not be exempt from the proposed amendment.
My name is Deb Hogshead. I live at 421 South Plum Street here in Troy. I'm also a volunteer with Move to Amend Miami County. And I'd like to offer 3 additional reasons why nonprofit corporations should not be exempt from the We the People Amendment. First, a nonprofit corporation does not need constitutional rights to protect the constitutional rights of its members or the people it serves. For example, in 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the NAACP, as an organization, could assert the constitutional rights of its individual members. This was not a corporate constitutional right being asserted, but rather a corporate entity standing up and protecting the constitutional rights of natural persons. The NAACP did not need its own constitutional rights to do this. Second, a corporate entity of any type with statutory privileges and protections from government overreach does not need, and historically has not needed, constitutional rights to succeed in its business. Having so-called constitutional rights, as granted by the Supreme Court starting back in 1886, is no protection against failing. Early in our nation's history, there was no such thing as corporate constitutional rights. The word corporation does not even appear in the U.S. Constitution. Legislators recognize the corrupting influence of money and corporate power. Here in Ohio, our pioneering legislators limited the duration of corporate charters, reserved the right to amend or revoke those charters when in the public's best interests, and forbade corporations from engaging in political activities.
In short, nonprofits, just as for-profits, associations, and unions, do not need constitutional rights to function and should not be exempt from the We the People Amendment. Democracy is messy, and the issues Dee Dee and I and Paula have mentioned tonight are complex. But if we are to have a democracy where our elected representatives are genuinely accountable to we the people, not to powerful corporate entities and the ultra-wealthy, we need an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that makes two things clear. Constitutional rights belong to natural persons only, and money spent on political campaigns is not protected speech and shall be regulated. Folks can learn more at movetoamend.org/corporate-constitutional-rights. Those who agree with us can sign the petition at movetoamend.org/motion. Also, you can call your representatives in Congress here in this area, that's either Mike Carey or Warren Davidson, and encourage them to co-sponsor the We the People Amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Sarah Camphy. I live at 1100 Winchester Drive in Troy. I received a letter last week about the public hearing. I live across the street from the property that is scheduled up for rezoning again. I'm hoping to be at the public hearing next week, in 2 weeks, but between now and then, I have a few questions that I'm going to preface this with, and maybe I'll give a few of you a call to see what your answers are in the next 2 weeks. So, with the move to a planned development, the proposal for that, I'm curious what the developer has said regarding home sizes. This was one of the issues that was brought up previously, was home sizes in the neighborhood, particularly because I noticed that the total homes that are being planned is slated at 189, where previously it was 194. It's not much of a difference. Just looking at the average lot size of that comes out to 0.24 acres per lot, which accounts for the amount of private open space, if you account for 58 acres total, roughly, and 12.5 acres for that private open space. So what is our square footage and the cost range for the homes? I'm just curious if the developer has said anything about that again. Related to that, what's the purpose for this development? So one of the points that was brought up before by the Chamber of Commerce president was that this was for workforce housing. If that's the case, does this fall in line with that, with this plan? If it's for step-up housing, has had also been mentioned before, I'd like to know how that comes into play. If it's for family homes, I can tell you that this lot size, which is similar to my lot size, isn't really a great size for a family that has 3 boys in it like I do. So I'm curious what the intended ownership is of this home, or any home in the development, really. Also related to that, with a planned development, in the notes for this, it says that the HOA is responsible for much of the items that the city would normally be responsible for in a typical zoned development, and by typical I mean something like R1 through R5. So, street repair, maintenance of the streets, plowing, trash removal, maintenance of the retention ponds, walking paths, playground equipment, all responsibility of the HOA. Right now in Kensington, we have responsibility of the retention ponds, and our HOA fees are $100 per year, which I know is quite cheap, actually. It's very cheap. I had expected before we moved into our development, they would be at least $100 per month. But honestly, if you have to pay for plowing, trash removal, upkeep of walking paths, playground equipment, which in Kensington, the walking paths, mowing, and the playground equipment is all upkeep of the city because it is a city park in Kensington, which is very much appreciated. It's a very utilized park in our neighborhood. Particularly maintenance of the streets, I can imagine that's going to be very expensive for the people living in that development, which comes down to what's the purpose of this development? Who are you trying to attract to this neighborhood? I think that maybe I was misunderstood when the rezoning went to a planned development. I thought that actually rezoning to the AR meant that a plan would still be able to be submitted and that the city would have responsibility for looking it over, not that it went right to planned development or that that would be the request. There is a comment in the documents that were submitted that it said that, you know, the surrounding neighborhoods, it falls in line with that. And the surrounding neighborhoods are zoned, the public use, or excuse me, the PUD, R4 and R2, and there's no planned development. And there was a comment actually in the documents too that says that the planned development feels a need for this kind of development in the community. I'm curious what that means, because what does it mean to actually have a need for a planned development? So there's a need for residents to pay more to live in that development versus having it zoned more like the surrounding communities. It's very obvious in the plans that were submitted too that the intention is to further develop the area to the west of this current plot of land as well as the area to the south. So what does that do then for those zonings? How are we going to do that? Because you're now extending out a very expensive neighborhood, and are you going to then zone it similar to that, or are you going to go back to a zoning maybe of a different neighborhood if you figure out that nobody can afford to live in it? Or maybe it doesn't even happen in that case. And my last point I wanted to ask about was traffic. I know that there's a speed study or a traffic flow study done sometime in the summer, shortly after the public hearing for this happened. What are the results of that study? My husband and I in particular had one of the transponders right outside of our fence line. We have a pole that's kind of on the corner. So we saw it, we knew it was up there. We contemplated going back and forth several times past it purposely, but we didn't do that. We didn't need to. There was already a lot of traffic that went by it, and, you know, I'm sure it caught a lot of stuff that, you know, maybe we don't always see during the day either. But I'd like to know if that is available to the public to see what kind of vehicles are we actually seeing going back there. We know there's lots of heavy equipment that's going past there in the evenings, lots of tractors, lots of people speeding back there, which, you know, speeding is relative, but when we're out back and our kids are playing and somebody decides to rev their cars, motorcycles, trucks, etc. every night, especially as we're getting ready for bed, it can become quite interesting on what we believe is the proper speed limit. It also kind of affects our thoughts on, you know, the access point for the development. Right now, it looks like the access point is going to be directly across from Huntington. So if that's the first phase and all of the traffic is coming in and out of that point, is there going to be a light plan for that space there? Is it still going to be a stop sign? What's kind of the intention for that particular access point? So those are some of our initial thoughts that we had as we got this letter and just started taking into consideration what this would mean. We honestly didn't know what was happening with the property because there's still a for sale sign up outside of it, so we weren't sure if the developer had changed their mind or not. So with that, I hope I can make it to the next meeting so I can hear what my neighbors think as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Are there any other residents that wish to speak this evening? Picking up on Mrs. Campy's comments, have we received results of that traffic study, and are they available?
I will check on that. I know that they've done one. I know that that was submitted and analyzed before it went to the planning commission. If it's, if it's there, it's public information,
Okay.
we can make that available.
That would be great. Thank you. If there are no other residents or any other comments, this meeting is adjourned.